right, let's talk about heartbeat. So we can all put our hand on our chest and we can feel that our heart has a rhythmic beat to it, right? And so we know that healthy hearts have this resting heartbeat around 70 to 80 beats per minute. Okay, and so that is an indicator of your heart health and also of your cardiovascular health in the sense of the health of your blood vessels and your blood volume. There are a couple of terms I would like you to know. So first is this term systole, which is talking about the contraction of the muscle tissue of the chambers of the heart. And so that contraction is when that muscle tissue is constricting around the blood in that chamber and then forcing it either to the next chamber, if we're talking about the atria contracting, forcing it down into the ventricles, right? Or if we're talking about the ventricular tissue contracting, then that contraction is going to force the blood out of the arteries, right? So going up into the aorta or going up into the pulmonary trunk, right? So then our heart tissue contracts and then it has to relax in order for those chambers to fill up with blood again. And so that is called diastole, okay? And so diastole is that relaxation. And so the muscle tissue relaxes, right? The sarcomeres lengthen out. And so then the chamber fills up with blood again to prepare for another round of contraction or systole. And I think we talked about this a little bit already, but if we take a cross section of the heart and actually look at the thickness of the myocardium or the muscle tissue, right, we can see that the left ventricle's myocardium is much thicker than the myocardium of the right ventricle. And so why is this? Why exactly is this? The answer is because the left ventricle, when it's contracting, when it does systole, that contraction is pushing the blood into the systemic circuit. Right, which is your whole entire body. And so it needs to be a very forceful, big contraction. So that thick muscle tissue needs to be there in order to allow for that continual big contraction and big push to get that blood into the systemic circuit, to get it to all the cells in your body, right? All your organs, tissues, and every single cell in your body is going to get that beautiful blood. Okay. And so in comparison, the right ventricle is only moving blood to the pulmonary circuit, right? And so that is really not a far place to travel, right? So think about where your heart is in relationship to your lungs, right? Your heart is nestled right between them. And so really we're talking about inches, right, of a path in order for the blood to get to all the vessels, all with your lung tissue. And so doesn't need to be a real thick muscle layer there in order to facilitate that continual push to your lungs. Let's look at heart valves a little bit. So heart valves, right? There's 4 different valves. Remember, there are the 2, what we call atrioventricular valves, which is the tricuspid and the bicuspid or mitral valves, right? And then there are the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves, right? That are at the base of those arteries, right? Okay, so in general, these are made up of a fibrous connective tissue with endothelium, so simple squamous epithelium coating over them. Okay, so they are coated in epithelium. And for the atrioventricular valves only, the ventricular valves are connected to papillary muscles via these cord-like streams called chordae tendineae. And so I want to go ahead and add that into our heart drawing that we did. Way down, there it is. I want to go ahead and add that in here. Ooh. Okay. Oops. Okay. So let's see. Let's pick. How about purple? Okay. So I'm going to draw little strings. So again, this is only concerning the valves between the atria and the ventricles, or what we're calling the atrioventricular valves. Okay. And so right now what I'm drawing are the chordae tendineae. Let's see here. Chordae tendineae. Okay. That are these cord-like tendons that are attached to these papillary muscles that live within the wall of the ventricles. Okay. And they do look kind of like these pimple-like protrusions. And so we're going to see that when the papillary muscles contract, they pull down on these cords, on these chordae tendineae. And by pulling on the cords, it pulls on the valve tissue and keeps them kind of staked down and taut to prevent the blood from flowing back up into the atrial chambers. Okay, we're going to see that the semilunar valves, the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve, do not have chordae tendineae. They are 3 flaps of tissue, and we're going to see that they don't need chordae tendineae in order for their flaps to work. And so let's go ahead and talk about that a little bit. Okay. All right. So if we look at a cross section of the heart valves, this is kind of what we see. So we see the tricuspid. So this is right and this is left. Okay. So we see the tricuspid and that there are 3 folds of tissue there. And then we see the bicuspid or the mitral valve, and we see how there are just 2 flaps of tissue there. Okay. Whereas if we look at how the aortic semilunar valve lives at the base of the aorta, we see 3 flaps of tissue, and the pulmonary semilunar valve also 3 flaps of tissue. And when you look at these semilunar valves, they actually do look like half moon pieces of tissue. And so that's why they're called that. That's why they have this name, semilunar. Semi means half and lunar means moon. Okay. Now, what's happening when the atrioventricular valves are working? So the atrioventricular valves, again, these are we're talking about the tricuspid and bicuspid valves. Okay. And again, they're called that because they live between the atria and the ventricles. And remember that they are attached to the chordae tendineae. I always forget that E, sorry. Okay, and then which are attached to papillary muscles, okay? Okay, so when the atria are gonna fill up first. When the atria fill up first, okay, a lot of that is filling up from some blood pressure, very minor blood pressure, but blood is pooling into the atria. And because the papillary muscles are relaxed, those pieces, valve pieces, are just kind of free, kind of not taut, able to move. Okay. And so as the blood is filling up in the atria, I think of these valve pieces as kind of like little kitchen doors that can easily swing open, right? And so because the blood's flowing from the top, they can easily swing down into the ventricles. Okay. And that's what we see here. they swing down. They're kind of down in the ventricle here, and then blood can continue on into the ventricle. Now, when the atria are mostly full, then the atria tissue contracts, and that causes the blood to, any remaining blood to go down into the ventricles. Okay, so first the atria, the top chambers contract, forcing blood down. And then the second thing that happens is the ventricles contract. So when the ventricles contract, right before that ventricular tissue is contracting fully, the papillary muscles also contract. And so by having the papillary muscles contract, they pull down on the chordae tendineae, and we see, right, imagine there's a bunch of chordae tendineae here, and then here's the papillary muscles. They pull down on it and causing those flaps to come together. Okay. And gets them kind of down and together and in place. So when the ventricles contract now, because they're mostly full of blood, the blood hits actually up against the valve tissue. Boom, can't go back up in the atria. So there's only one little hole, or not really little, but there's one hole that the blood can flow out of, and that's going to be, right, the artery holes. So either it's gonna flow into the pulmonary trunk and then the pulmonary arteries, or it's going to flow out the aorta. Okay, and so that's what they're doing, is they're preventing that one-way, that backflow. They're causing a one-way flow of blood through the heart and preventing the blood from flowing back. Okay, now what about the semilunar valves? The semilunar valves, these are at the base of the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. They're also preventing the backflow of blood. Okay, and so that's what their job is as well. So when, and remember that they're not attached to any chordae tendineae or papillary muscles. Okay, and so they initially flap open and basically flap up into the artery lumen or hole that they live in when the ventricles contract. And the blood from the ventricles flows up into those arteries. So this is pretty good, you know, blood pressure, right? This force of pushing that blood up. Okay. And then what happens is not all the blood makes it all the way out of these arteries. Some of it can seep back down from whence it came, especially thinking about gravity, right? And so when that blood kind of flows back, it basically naturally causes those cusps, those pieces, the three flaps of tissue, to lay down on each other in a nice little tripod, little three arrangement. And so that their overlap and their cusp is what creates them from making this block, so that blood cannot flow back down into the heart. Okay. Okay, so it prevents backflow into the heart. And specifically, we're talking about the ventricles. Okay, pretty cool. So taking all this together, your heart sounds. What exactly are you hearing when you're listening to the beating of a heart? Are you listening to the contraction of that muscle? Do our muscles make sounds when they contract? No, that'd be super weird, right? Because think about I'm talking right now and I'm standing and I'm moving, I'm doing all these things. I have so many different muscles that are contracting. I'm not making any sounds, right, from contracting my muscles. So what is this lupped up or lub dub sound, the boom sound that you're hearing? You are hearing the blood hitting the valves. You're hitting the blood hitting the closed valves. So I'm going to go back down to our picture. Okay. So the first sound, the lup or the lub, is the sound of the blood hitting our tricuspid and our bicuspid valves. Okay, so that's the first sound, boom. Because the atria contract first and then the ventricles contract second. So boom, hit. And then the second sound is you're hearing the blood hitting the closing of the semilunar valve. So that's the dup or the dub sound. Boom, boom. That's the second sound within a heartbeat. So boom, 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 boom. So bicuspid, tricuspid valve hitting first, boom, lup. Second sound, semilunar valves, blood hitting those, boom. Okay, isn't that cool? I love it. Okay, so we can actually sort out where to place our stethoscope in order to hear the sounds of the valves and determine if they're closing properly or if there's what's called a heart murmur, where there is some black flow of blood, either a little or a lot going on. And so we can place that stethoscope in various parts. I'm not going to test you on this, but I just think it's kind of neat. And so this is what healthcare professionals are trained to do, to be able to look at your valve health just by listening to the lupped up sound of your heart. And so they can determine if you have a specific heart murmur, a specific issue with one of your 4 valves. Okay, this is where I'm going to stop. We'll see you on the next one.